Let me just get started. My name is Daniel Fitzgerald, and I am a master's student, or master's graduate, I guess, of Master Food Identity, a program that's an Erasmus Mundus funded program. And I spent the last 9 months or so working under the direction of Åsa Strand at the IVL and also at AquaVitae. And this is the brief presentation, shortened, condensed version of my thesis. And so I'm happy to take it from here. Hold on one second. I'm going to do presenter mode.
Yeah, okay. But before we begin, Daniel, can I just ask you, like, why the oyster market? How did you become interested in that?
So that's actually the first slide. That's perfect. So we were looking at oyster markets throughout Europe and throughout the AquaVitae countries. And what we found was there was a stagnation of markets. Most of the growth of oyster aquaculture has come from Asia over the last 30 years. Within the countries that we looked at, within Europe and some countries in North and South America, we found that the oyster markets were stagnant. And this was limited by political situations, regulatory issues, economic and financing availability, as well as technological capacity, depending on the country. So our goal in this thesis was to focus on the production and the consumption of oysters in 7 countries around the Atlantic Ocean. The objective of this thesis was to develop a better understanding of what parameters need to be in place in order to help oyster markets expand by extracting knowledge from mature oyster markets and understanding how this information can be applied to less mature markets in order to help both their production and consumption of oysters grow. I don't obviously need to say to people in the AquaVitae consortium how important oysters are for carbon sequestration, nitrogen sequestration, cleaning the water as a form of sustainable protein. So it felt like it was important for me to kind of study how we can grow oyster markets and increase oyster consumption in order to have a better sense of the 21st century and sustainability problems. So now we're going to briefly look at the methodology that we used. For this research project, I worked within AquaVitae. As I said, AquaVitae is a research and innovation project funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 Sustainability Program. The countries that are included in the AquaVitae case study 8 were selected for further study. That is to say, United States. Yes.
I just wanted to interrupt you. I can't see your presentation right now.
Oh, no?
So.
Sorry. Let's see. Thank you for the interruption. Can you see?
There you go. Yeah, that was perfect.
So we just had some things like this in terms of stagnation of markets, but that's what you missed. But so we were looking at these different countries: United States, Brazil, France, Ireland, Sweden, South Africa, and Namibia. We did this so I could rely on the expertise of the academics that were contracted on the ground in each partner country, so I could ask them questions through and collect data through their expertise. 2 of these countries we found were so large that we split them up into 2 distinct regions. Those countries were Brazil and United States. And so we divided them into North and South because we found that they had some similarities between the regions within such a large country. In order to do data collection, we started with a questionnaire that was developed by the AquaVitae consortium, and we sent this out to a team of experts on the ground in each region that I just mentioned. Then I followed this up by interviewing them in person, or rather via Skype and Zoom, so I could better understand elaboration on the questionnaire. And then I supplemented this with bibliographic research of each country. So we looked for this data across the values of this data across all of the regions, and then this data formed the basis of our analysis. We were looking at total weight, value, species that were cultivated of oysters, what methods were used, whether there was a wild harvest existing, whether the seed source was from hatcheries or wild collection, what, if any, were the food safety standards to bring it to market, whether there was an export or import market, and what value added products were developed in that. And that kind of allowed us to quantify various values to have a better, more objective basis of comparison. So then we put those parameters into a value chain that we developed. And the value chain was trying to understand from the very beginning to the final consumer. And we realized that it wasn't enough to just start talking about producers, because we needed to understand what motivations, what policies were in place on the government level to incentivize production. So we actually started our value chain 1 step back in terms of broad economic and government policy factors, And then we went to input providers, production providers, wholesalers, and domestic consumers to understand moving forward kind of from the entire value chain. And as you can see here in this slide, underneath each of the steps of the value chain, we have a parameter. Those are going to be the basis of parameters as we move forward. So I'm not going to read them right now because that's going to constitute the bulk of this presentation. Finally, we analyzed each value-adding parameter and categorized it according to its place within the pest analysis. A pest analysis is a tool for understanding an industry and to assess major factors that allow it to become more competitive in the market. Our pest analysis was done for the oyster sector on the transatlantic scale to utilize the information presented in all the case studies to achieve a more general and broader analysis. By identifying best practices optimized within each parameter of the pest analysis, the thesis aimed to demonstrate ways to grow the entire oyster industry in each case study presented here. I want to say that we visualized the pest analysis like a pyramid because we found that each parameter naturally built upon the other. And so here at the base of the pyramid, we have political parameters. One step above that, we have economic parameters. Above that, technological, above that, social. And that kind of is how you construct an oyster market from bottom to top. And so what I want to say before we move forward into the results and discussion of this thesis is that each case study, each country review displayed some strengths and some weaknesses according to the pest analysis parameter. And we're going to look at this pyramid piece by piece in greater length in order to better understand each parameter and how it fits within the larger transatlantic oyster market. So now we're moving on to the results and discussion. So the political constitutes four things: leasing, terms of the lease, continuous use, and efficient governance. So we found that through leasing, the government body can determine where oyster aquaculture can take place and balance competing nearshore interests. Increasing the total area available for oyster cultivation by granting more leases to producers is one way to boost production. For example, the state of Maryland in the United States, in the northern United States, has managed to increase its oyster production through the expansion of permitted oyster aquaculture leases. In contrast, Sweden, as a less good example, shoreline protection prevents activities 200 to 300 meters out of the shoreline, and special permission must be obtained from the owners of the private property in order to operate in such areas. This obviously limits the total area available for oyster cultivation. In addition, in terms of the terms, the government must set the price and length for cultivation leases in order to establish the market. The price of leases and licenses must be reasonable, low enough to allow new entrants, but high enough to ensure a continued sustained interest in cultivation. In South Africa, leases are among the highest in the world, and that's 13 times higher than those charged in neighboring Namibia. The fee is one of the most significant factors hindering growth and preventing entry into the sector in South Africa. Deterring potential aquaculture operators inhibits the overall growth of the sector. In addition, leases must be granted for a long enough period of time to allow for sustained investment by individual aquaculture farmers, but not too long to calcify the industry or prevent new entrants of new and inspiring farmers. For example, South Africa and Sweden only approve permits for 3 to 5 years, after which it has to be renewed, but this does not allow for enough time for capital investment in equipment, in any source of investment in towards the property. At the same time, in France, the leases are granted for 30 years. Some leases are granted for 30 years, which obviously prevents the entrance of new operators, new ideas, and new forms of dynamic cultivation. Then once the leases are granted, they should allow for continuous use, which is to say that oyster aquaculture is continually farmed in the areas that the lease is granted. This prevents waterfront property owners to take leases, for example, just to preserve their unobstructed views of the shoreline. Finally, in terms of efficient governance, a one-stop shop or point of contact where farm operators can apply for all the necessary federal, state, and local level permits in one place is helpful to promote aquaculture. As the oyster industry develops, it interacts with a variety of government regulations at a variety of levels, and it becomes increasingly important to streamline the process. For example, in Maryland, again in the northern United States, there's a one-stop shop access for permitting for federal, state, and local levels. Whereas in South Africa, there's right now an uncoordinated legal framework and overregulation that hampers the development of aquaculture because the operators have to go to too many steps and too much bureaucracy in order to get their licenses. So government should streamline the process in order to facilitate long and complex processes for aquaculture. The next level that we found is economic. 2 economic strategies developed for aquaculture that we identified was the most important, and that is financing opportunities as well as insurance. And so we're going to start with financing. What we found is that as regions move from wild harvest or extensive cultivation of aquaculture, and oyster aquaculture, I should say, to more intensive forms of cultivation, the availability of financing is an important step in industry growth. Setting up aquaculture farms is, especially intensive cultivation, requires an initial upfront investment that's quite large. The United States, as an example, makes it easy to obtain startup capital through the Farm Service Administration, which provides loans for small operators and potential entrants who do not qualify for conventional lending. In contrast, in Ireland, there's right now a lack of legitimized leases, and it's a key constraint on oyster farmers' ability to obtain capital. If a producer does not have an established license, then they're not able to access EU, national, or rural development grants, which hampers their potential growth and expansion. Secondly, crop insurance. Crop insurance protects farmers against natural disasters or disease-induced mortality events, and it can also protect equipment investments against depreciation, theft, or destruction. While insurance for aquaculture operators was available in most regions, its use was not extensive. In Namibia, as a positive example, government financial support played a decisive role in the recovery of oyster sectors following the harmful algae blooms of 2008, when nearly an entire year of production was lost. Subsidies and insurance helped to rebuild this industry. So this is an example of how insurance helps promote aquaculture. Moving on to the technological, which is the next step on the pyramid, we found that the widespread availability of hatchery-produced seeds is one of the most important strategies for growing an oyster market. The availability of high-quality seeds is one of the greatest production limitations across all regions. Wild seed collection, though cheaper than hatchery-produced, leaves too many variables to chance, and as oyster production matures, regions move from wild seed to importation of spat to finally domestic production of spat. So as oyster markets mature, they should produce hatchery spat. Hatcheries located close to grow-out sites are important as oyster markets mature. Importing spat increases the possibility of importing disease. In addition, imported seeds are not bred for local waters and thus reduce biodiversity and, by extension, seed resilience. Namibia is a perfect case study in this. It started off by importing oyster spat from Chile, but as production matured, it developed its own domestic production of spat using several commercial hatcheries. Now it even exports those seeds to South Africa. Hatcheries reduce the risk of imported disease and invasive species as well, which allows for the development of spat, which is better adapted to local waters. Triploids is another process that can help develop oyster markets. Triploids can only be developed in hatcheries, and they're an important indicator of the development of oyster markets. Triploids allow for year-round consumption because it reduces the gumminess associated with oysters during the spawning season. In addition, some countries in the southern hemisphere are able to grow oysters during the off-season for the northern hemisphere, which could increase export markets as well. Triploid production accounts for a very high production of shellfish hatchery output in the United States and France, but less developed markets make less use of it because it's a very technologically complex process. Finally, food safety standards are essential to maintain customer trust and safety in the food market, especially with regards to the distribution and consumption of shellfish. And this has a few different aspects. Water monitoring programs are important for minimizing the chances that harvested oysters come from contaminated waters. But once those oysters are harvested, post-processing facilities such as UV deparation, pasteurization, or high-pressure processing can improve the safety and shelf life without compromising oyster flavor. Traceability is obviously one of the most important things at each step of the supply chain to guarantee customer safety and minimize the danger posed by a disease outbreak should one occur. We found that actually lack of food safety standards acted as a barrier for the expansion of some markets. For example, the United States and the EU have the highest food safety standards, and these countries ban imports from countries that don't have similarly high standards. Namibia and South Africa are unable to export their oysters to Europe and to the United States because they don't have water monitoring programs in place that are up to EU standards. So they export to the Far East, to Asia. But it would be perfect to export to Europe or the United States because of the way that the summer spawning season works in each country, and so, or each continent and each hemisphere. And so it would be a way to grow the oyster market. Finally, we found the social was the last thing, and that is the establishment of producer cooperatives, labeling and certification, as well as native species cultivation. So the importance of human capital is a way to grow the oyster market. Organizations of individual producers into cooperative productions and collective marketing strategies is another way to grow oyster markets, because by pooling their resources together, producers lower initial investment costs, they stabilize the market by setting prices as well as coordinating on supply quotas, and they can lobby government with one voice for beneficial policies. In Brazil, cooperatives also provide training to members and improve the efficiency of day-to-day management for the members, including regular cleaning of equipment, planting ahead using data from previous production records. In Sweden, smaller producers pool resources and share equipment as well, which improves their efficiency. In addition, labeling is important for consumer education when it comes to overcoming consumer objections to eating raw shellfish, for example. Local and geographic designations of origin increase customer connection to producers and the understanding about the nature of the product. This includes organic, PDO, PGI, and any other types of value-added labeling requirements that can designate the specificity and typicity of each of the oysters. Right now, there's no labeling for triploids versus natural oysters, which could be one of the things that helps these markets grow. In addition, we found that native oyster cultivation and native oyster species is an untapped market. Most of the oysters cultivated are Pacific cupped oysters, but a lot of these regions have native oysters, whether it be flat oysters in Europe, whether it be Atlantic oysters in the United States, whether it be mangrove oysters in Brazil. The native species often fetches higher prices due to its overall scarcity and its market niche. Therefore, in order to boost oyster farmer incomes as well as the availability of native species, consumers should be educated about the difference between native and exotic species through labeling and other means, and this will help boost farmer income. So now, in conclusion, I want to show you briefly, because I'm actually surprisingly on time today. This is an overall summary. We have three colors here for colorblind people. We have green, which is the highest level, yellow is the medium, and blue is, think of it as red, it's the lowest, in terms of all the parameters that we looked at across all of the regions. The objective of this thesis was to develop a better understanding of what parameters need to be in place in order to help oyster markets expand. Some of the regions with more mature productions contain many of the parameters necessary for market expansion. Others with less mature productions contain fewer of these parameters. No region was totally optimized and no region was totally unoptimized. Some regions were more mature in some aspects and less mature in others. These parameters cut across geographic boundaries, climate, wealth, and political structures. There was no one-size-fits-all prescription that could apply to all regions. For example, France is a very mature market whose production is shrinking each year. In contrast, Namibia has almost no history or culture of oyster cultivation and invented an entire industry whole cloth in the last 30 years. This thesis identified many of the best practices in government and technology that could alleviate some of the factors that are currently limiting production of oysters in each region. If these best practices are implemented across regions and adapted to local conditions, the oyster aquaculture will be allowed to grow and reach its full potential in the Atlantic region. I want to thank you all for your time today for this presentation. The original version of it was about 45 minutes or an hour, so if I went too fast, that's why we left about 10 minutes now for question and answer. So thank you for your time today, and I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. As an American, I want to make sure that I include that as well. So have a great day.
Thank you very much, Daniel. First off, before we begin the Q&A session, just to give people time to write in the chat or raise your hand, what parameter would you say is the most important in order to have a good foundation for oyster agriculture?
That's a great question. I think that what we found was leasing areas were the most important thing. Having private property rights for oyster cultivation allows for more producers to invest individually in their production, to grow their production, and also from an ecological perspective, it reduces the tragedy of the commons. You know, we found that some producers in Brazil that before they had developed a cooperative, for example, they were just, you know, harvesting wild oysters out of these mangrove areas. And as a result, the sustainability was going down and down and down every year because of overexploitation of the resources. So having clearly defined leases and structures allows for the development of personal investment as well as government loans in the case of Ireland, as we saw. So I found that leasing areas is one of the most important things for having very clear leasing areas and clear licensing structures for allowing for the cultivation of these different oyster aquaculture regions.
Very good. I don't see any questions in the chat or any raised hands so far. Oh, actually, there's one from Lars Eriksson. Do you have a link for your thesis?
Yes, I will be more than happy to send it around. It's on a PDF form. I'm not sure if I put it online yet, but I have it on PDF form. I'm going to make a note to myself. Maybe we can circulate it to people who have signed up for this webinar, and you could read the entire 60 pages or so of the thesis itself.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, we're gonna send a link to everybody who's participating in the meeting for the YouTube
and also,
presentation.
the condensed version of the thesis, I believe, will be included in case study 8 for the AquaVitae project as well. So there will be a version of it as well in publication for AquaVitae.
Great. I don't see no raised hands or questions in the chat, so I'll just go ahead and ask another question. What would be the most cost-effective government intervention to grow oyster cultivation in each country?
What we found was from starting the leasing areas was so important, but actually hatcheries was one of the things that really made the biggest difference in terms of growing production. The producers that we interviewed, many of them cited lack of available seeds as the biggest thing hindering their growth. They wanted more seeds, they could have planted more seeds, they had the space to cultivate more seeds, but it was the lack of availability of seeds which was a problem. In some regions, like the southern United States, producers will harvest oysters seeds from the wild cultivation, and that is good. But as I said, it leaves a lot of variables to chance, and in addition, it could lead towards overexploitation of these things. So establishing hatcheries, and I want to emphasize here that hatcheries are a very technologically intense project. It's not something that you can just set up because you want to. You really need to have training and capital intensive resources to do it. It's kind of a big investment. But once there are seeds and hatcheries that are available, then not only are Pacific cupped oysters more widely available, but also it can lead to the cultivation of native species as well, which, as I said, has a variety of benefits from cultivating diversity, biodiversity, making sure that the reefs are intact as well in the native places. So I would say that if I were to recommend governments to fund any initiative of the things that we discussed today, hatcheries is the largest bang for your buck, because an increasing amount of seeds leads to increasing amounts of cultivation, which would rebuild some of the reefs that have been destroyed, and in addition allow for greater cultivation. So I think hatcheries is a wonderful thing as well.
We actually have 2 more questions from Lars. The first one is, what is the price of oysters in the different places?
That's a great question. So we looked at some data in terms of, not necessarily in terms of the price of each one, because we found that in less developed markets like Brazil, they're very seasonal in the sense that, like everything else, when you don't have producer coordination, the price is not set. And so during the high season, the oysters are the cheapest, and that's when they're most bountifully available. During the low season, that's when the oysters are the most expensive. And so we looked more at it in terms of seasonally, how the price changed and fluctuated over time, as well as the difference between the native oyster species as well as the Pacific oyster or the aquaculture species versus the wild harvest species. And we found actually that in some regions it was different. For example, in the United States, the aquaculture fetches a higher premium price over wild harvest. And in Sweden and in Europe, it was the opposite, actually, that wild oysters, because they're so scarce, actually commanded a higher price than cultivated oysters. And in Brazil, for example, we found that native species oysters cultivated, got much lower price than Pacific oysters. oysters because there was kind of a threat of food safety standards. A lot of the more educated consumers wanted aquaculture oysters that were Pacific cupped oysters rather than the other ones. So we looked at it not in terms of a fixed number, but more in terms of how each market had expressed itself within the relationship between aquaculture and wild harvest, as well as between native species and between exotic species. So.
Last had a second question here. Are triploids still under patent rights?
That is a good question. Actually, I would have to look into that. I know that triploids exist only in hatchery production, and I know that there is, some intellectual property rights within that because, people can patent seeds and, varieties of different things. But I actually did not know that within a triploid. So I would have to look into that. That's a good question. I would be curious because the process to make triploids, there's several ways of making them, either by introducing a certain chemical at a certain point or introducing heat treatment at certain points that kind of neuters it. But I'm not sure if those things are proprietary or not. That's a great question.
I don't see any more raised hands or questions, but I'm kind of curious about a thing here. Like your thesis is to better understand the parameters, what needs to be in place to help expand the oyster market and come up with best practice for the different regions. But could you perhaps elaborate a little bit about, what are the greatest challenges of actually implementing these best practices?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Well, that's why it was important for me to talk about good governance because, aquaculture by its very nature comes into conflict with a lot of different shoreline uses, right? And so, you have people that want to ride their boats and people that want to fish and people that want to do shellfish activities and people that just want to have pristine views. And so government by its very nature has to kind of balance a lot of nearshore competing interests in order to make aquaculture work. We found, a good solution would be, in Brittany, for example, in France, there was like offshore cultivation of oysters on buoys and things like this, and they kind of replicated it. But the problem was a lot of the times oyster, especially with the price of gas being what it is nowadays, oyster producers don't want to take a boat ride 20 minutes, 30 minutes to the middle of the ocean to kind of get the oysters that they used to just be able to kind of wade out to in the water. And so it's important to try and have government efficiency and government streamlined if they wanted to kind of implement any of these things. This case of Maryland with its one-stop shop where you could apply for all of the different environmental, local, national, state, federal regulations is very helpful if it wants to encourage aquaculture because it makes the process a little bit more streamlined. And when it comes to balancing a lot of nearshore interests, because obviously farming, traditional farming, you could just own a piece of land and farm on it. But with aquaculture, because it's leasing and because it's, shared use of water, it makes it a little bit more complicated. So having a streamlined sense of government and a policy that, is more clearly delineated from the EU or from the national government makes it much more helpful. I'll give one more example. With the case of Ireland, I kind of touched on this a little bit, but Ireland, they were not in compliance with it wasn't Horizons 2020, but it was a EU environmental law that was implemented in 1994 to make sure that the birds had sanctuary. It was like for a bird sanctuary, and so like no productive activities could take place in the areas that were bird sanctuary. But Ireland had already leased a bunch of that shoreline area to oyster cultivators and oyster aquaculture cultivators. And so then after this EU initiative directive in 1994, a lot of those leases were kind of in limbo state. They were invalidated because they were no longer in compliance with this notion of having sanctuaries along the shoreline, even though aquaculture is not very intensive and it doesn't really, produce the same problems as farming would, for example. And so it was one of the things that we saw was a problem when it came for Ireland getting leases and Irish operators getting loans and insurance because technically they didn't have a valid lease on the EU level. On the Irish level, they kind of did. They were in the middle of this limbo state. So I think it just recently became cleared up, like by 2006. But for about 20 years, a lot of these producers, or 10 years, a lot of these producers were in the state of limbo, which really hindered cultivation. And so a lot of the times, Irish producers are actually growing juveniles and then exporting them back to France to be finished and sold as French oysters, which is another example of kind of trying to use labeling in order to kind of add value. So that was a long-winded answer. I apologize. I hope I touched on a few of the things that were interesting. And
that's why we do this, to finally get somebody to speak out about this. So thank you very much for doing the presentation today. We're out of time now, but I encourage everybody who's interested to go to our website at the AquaVitae project.eu. I'm putting a link in the chat right now. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. Our next webinar will be on December 15th. I will send out information about that later. Thank you much for joining us here today. And of course, thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much for having me.